Okay, folks, welcome to another From the Woods Today. This month for December, we have the 12 Days of Christmas. Many folks are familiar, I'd venture a guess, probably everyone listening, with the song The 12 Days of Christmas. It's easily one of the most popular Christmas songs in the US. And it's a weird song in some ways. It's themed around someone giving gifts to their beloved partner. It's very repetitive, right? You have the first verse, then you repeat the first verse and add a second verse, then you repeat the first and the second, adding a third and a fourth, and it repeats so on and so forth, which is probably the aspect that makes the song charming, I guess, in the first place. Then of course you've got the 5 golden rings, which is, sort of gift-like, kind of a normal type gift, jewelry, although I think 5 seems a little excessive, but I guess if they're your true love, you're giving them these 5 rings. I'm not really sure. But the thing that's kind of interesting about the others is there's a lot of actual human beings apparently being given as gifts, but there's also a lot of birds, which is what brings us to the 12 Days of Christmas from the Woods Today, a bird of the month. Just as a reminder to those who maybe haven't heard the song in a while, don't get excited. I'm not going to sing it for you, but just an overview of what we have. We have, of course, a partridge in a pear tree, 2 turtle doves, 3 French hens, 4 calling birds, 5 gold rings or golden rings, 6 geese a laying, 7 swans a swimming, 8 maids a milking, 9 ladies dancing, 10 lords a leaping, 11 pipers piping, and 12 drummers drumming. Important to remember that not all of these are birds, so we're not going to cover them, so we're going to swipe out anything that's not a bird. Now, you'll notice that I have 5 gold rings crossed out in a different color. We're going to return to that because there may be bird themes there as well. But for most of today, we're going to cover the partridge in a pear tree, the 2 turtle doves, 3 French hens, 4 calling birds, 6 geese a laying, and 7 swans a swimming. So let's dive into the avian components of the 12 Days of Christmas, discuss each of the species or taxa in the song, or at least describe them as best we can, and then we'll dive into some of the Kentucky counterparts for each of these 12 Days of Christmas. All right, so we're going to start with the partridge in a pear tree. So I'm not an expert on this song. I know a thing or two about birds, but I don't know that much about this song. So I've had to do a little bit of background research for it. And I don't actually claim any of this information that's not bird related to be accurate, but I've done my very best here. And from what I can tell, the exact kind of partridge that the partridge in a pear tree refers to is somewhat unclear. It's also weird that the bird is in a pear tree, since the partridges that are likely to be the partridges referenced in the song are the kind of birds that spend most of their time on the ground. There are some versions of the song that I found that describe a partridge and a pear tree. Others seem to believe that pear tree was added after. I found some accounts that indicated that maybe the pear tree is just a repetition of partridge that is translated incorrectly. But regardless, the partridge referenced in the partridge in a pear tree appears to either be the red-legged partridge, which is this handsome bird here, or the gray partridge, which is this lovely critter here. Now, sometimes these species are kept in North America through the aviculture world, but a species that is also not native, but many folks are more familiar with because of their release for hunting purposes, would be the chukar, or sometimes called the chukar partridge. It's a weird bird. It looks actually a lot like the red-legged partridge. It received its name because its vocalization sounds like it's saying chukar. So that's the partridge in a pear tree from the song, either the gray partridge or the red-legged partridge. But But these birds are not species that we have here in Kentucky or in North America. We have that's probably the closest is the ruffed grouse, Bonasa umbellus. Now, of course, the partridge is kind of a weird concept. As far as ornithologists can tell, a partridge is not what we call a monophyletic clade. That is fancy jargon for saying partridges aren't all necessarily each other's closest relatives. So a partridge tends to be shorthand or a catch-all term for like short-legged, fat, gallinaceous birds. And of course, gallinaceous being a fancy term for chicken-like. So of course, we have the ruffed grouse here in Kentucky. It's the closest thing that I think we're going to have, maybe with one other exception that we'll discuss in a bit, to a partridge. So we're going to think of the ruffed grouse as our partridge. They're a bit smaller than a chicken. They're found in eastern Kentucky's forests, and they prefer to be in forested landscapes that have heavy disturbance. It's a really cool bird. We've talked about it on From the Woods Today before. They've got a slightly longer tail than your sort of partridge type birds with this black band across it. They've got this little crest, and the males have feathers in here, like really like dark, fluffy feathers they can hide in their neck. And that's the ruff, where it gets the name ruffed grouse. So when a male grouse is displaying for a female, in addition to flapping his wings and producing a thumping, they also can fluff out that ruff and display for the female. So that'll be our partridge. Let me know if anyone sees one in a pear tree. Two turtle doves. So this one's relatively straightforward. So there's a genus of doves, Streptopelia, and the Streptopelia doves are kind of referred to as the turtle doves. It's a really widespread genus of doves. But easily the European turtle dove may be the turtle dove described in the song. It's a common backyard dove in much of Europe. Probably suitable as pets, although I don't know how often they're actually kept as pets, and they're also edible. So probably a pretty reasonable thing to give as a gift, I suppose. In Kentucky, we don't have that group of doves native. We'll talk a bit more about it in a moment. But we do have the mourning dove, which is probably the most similar dove that we have. Unlike the Streptopelia doves, the mourning dove lacks this kind of dark collar that the Streptopelia doves have. It does have a little black cheek marking, some black spots on the secondary flight feathers on the wings, and it's also our only dove that we have that has a pointed tail. And it's a really interesting bird. I mean, it's a very heavily hunted game bird. Millions are harvested in the US every single year. And this is one of those things that's hard to think about. You're like, man, how can so many mourning doves be harvested every year, yet they're really widespread and abundant? Well, that's because when we harvest mourning doves, this is what's called compensatory mortality. In other words, it's not additive. So when you harvest a certain number of birds, that means that other birds that may or may not have lived through the winter can now survive. Resources have been freed up. So there's a certain number of birds that can be harvested and have no impact on the population. Now, at a certain point, that will eat through the compensatory mortality in a given year, and then that would be called additive, but not enough doves are harvested in the US for that to be. Okay, 3 French hens. So this one's also relatively straightforward as best I can tell. French may or may not refer to the actual country of France. It seems like maybe some accounts just meant French to be foreign. I'm not totally sure on that part. Other versions of the songs describe 3 fat hens. Regardless, it appears to be a hen in the context of the Gallus domesticus domestic chicken. So it does appear to be 3 fat domesticated chickens. And as we discussed during the last month, the Thanksgiving bird of the month, or we kind of dove into a bunch of different dinner table type birds, the domestic chicken is a large domesticated pheasant, as weird as that sounds. It's in the pheasant family. It's domesticated from the red jungle fowl, and many folks incorrectly believe that the chicken is the oldest domesticated bird. It's actually not. That award goes to the domesticated pigeon, which is also a delicious edible domesticated bird. However, the chicken has been domesticated for a very long time. Now, of course, we don't have chickens in Kentucky native. We do have many chickens that are owned and kept by people, but if we stopped caring for chickens, they would vanish from Kentucky's landscapes rather quickly. We have a native plump little game bird, however, that we'll say is our French hen, I guess, for the purposes of this. The northern bobwhite, Calinus virginianus. Here's a picture of a male that I found on iNaturalist. There's the links. I try and show the links for all of these if I can. The female has, where the male has this white throat and this white, you can think of it as an eyebrow. The technical term is a supercilium. Where the male has a white throat and eyebrow, the female would have kind of a caramel golden color instead. And where the male has black, the female tends to have like sort of a drabber brown. So there's the male northern bobwhite. Of course, Gallus gallus being from Asia. The northern bobwhite is our chicken for the purposes of this. It's what we call a New World quail. So we've got New World quails, and there are also Old World quails. So if you've ever kept quail in an agricultural setting, for instance, the Coturnix quail is a domesticated form of the Japanese quail. They're not really particularly related to the New World quails. They're in the same family, but they're not like taxonomically similar. They just convergently look like our New World quails. Now, the northern bobwhite, like a lot of the other New World quails, it's a very social bird. They live in small flocks in the wintertime that are called coveys. They're named, they get the name Bob White from that whistling song where the male will go Bob White in the springtime. And it's important to recognize that northern bobwhites, like a lot of grassland-dependent birds, are declining very rapidly across their range. It's a game bird, so it's heavily hunted in certain areas. That hunting doesn't seem to be the thing that's driving their decline. It appears to be the loss of grasslands and disturbance-dependent ecosystems, describing why we're losing our bobwhites. For calling birds. So this is a very interesting one. One thing that I've learned in exploring all this, apparently the name of this was not supposed to be a calling bird, it was supposed to be a collie bird. And you're like, well, what the heck is a collie bird? Well, apparently the origin of the word collie is a little bit messy. It could be the same origin as the dog, the collie. Other accounts seem to be a reference to like being sooty or coal colored. Regardless, a collie bird is the Eurasian blackbird, which is this guy that I've shown here. And if you're not familiar with the Eurasian blackbird, Turdus marula, it looks a lot like a black American robin. Well, the reason for this is that Turdus genus is the same genus that the American robin is in. So our four calling birds, or collies, are going to use the American robin as our stand-in. So we've discussed the American robin numerous times on Bird of the Month. It's in the not only is it in the genus Turdus, referring to a thrush, it's in the family Turdidae, which are kind of broadly known as the thrushes. These are these sort of plump birds with, they have relatively long wings, unlike game birds, but they're pretty plump birds. They spend a lot of time on the ground, very long legs, and they spend a lot of time running around on the ground, catching insects, and then in the wintertime, spending time looking for fruit. So the American robin is Turdus migratorius, a very highly migratory bird. With that said, it's year-round resident in Kentucky, so they breed during the spring and summer, and then of course during the fall and winter, which is where we're at now, this is the non-breeding season where we still have them. They'll oftentimes, though not always, form a flock in the winter. Sometimes they'll form mixed species flocks with things like starlings and other birds, and these big flocks will fly around seeking fruits and invertebrates and things like that. Okay, 6 geese a laying. This one's fairly straightforward. I believe it is referring to the domestic gray lag goose, Anser domesticus. This is a large-bodied barnyard goose. Many times the adults can't fly, although some gray-lag geese can fly. They're long-lived barnyard birds, and they're well recognized for being fairly aggressive and territorial in a domestic setting. The eggs are edible. Geese are laying, right? But keeping geese for their eggs, at least as best I can tell, is somewhat uncommon here in the U.S. They lay fewer but larger eggs than domesticated chickens and ducks and things like that. Perfectly edible, just not known for being particularly productive in terms of their eggs. Our geese laying that we're going to select as a Kentucky representative is the Canada goose, Branta canadensis. And everybody's familiar, I would venture to say, with the Canada goose, or at least the majority of us are. And they can be a frustrating bird just because they're so abundant, they're loud, they defecate all over your lawns, but honestly, they're very cool birds. They feed mostly on grass, which is very unusual in the bird world. There are very few birds that can subsist on grass. The Canada goose is one of them. They do this mate for life behavior, which is really endearing. So as long as the mate stays alive, they will stay with the same mate year after year, all year round. Highly migratory birds, very long-lived. They can live for decades in the wild. And at one point they declined so much that serious conservation action was needed, but we have now rebounded their population so much that they've become a nuisance. It's also kind of interesting they can and regularly do hybridize with other geese, including domestic gray-lag geese. Okay, 7 swans a-swimming. I believe that's the last one in our sequence here, and this refers originally to the mute swan. So these are pictures of the mute swan here. This is one with its wings up, and here's one with the wings down. They're not quite mute. They can make some hisses and grunts and some sort of other unpleasant noises, but they're beautiful birds regardless. Again, this upright wing posture is something they're famous for. Orange bill with this kind of black fleshy knob at the base of the head. The species has actually been introduced to the US and has become invasive. So a lot like Canada geese, they mate for life. They don't feed much on grass like Canada geese do, but do feed on aquatic vegetation and grains. Their invasive nature isn't particularly well understood. They seem like they can outcompete native waterfowl in some settings, but in other settings they seem like they're not as much of a problem, so clearly needs a lot more work. They're hunted in some states and protected in others, so it's an interesting species of bird. Now the mute swan is not going to be our Kentucky representative of a swan. I'm going to use the trumpeter swan. This is one of our 2 native swans we have here in Kentucky, with the trumpeter swan being the larger species that we have here. Unlike the mute swan, it does not have that kind of bulging, fleshy black knob at the base of the forehead, and its bill, unlike the mute swan, is not orange. It is instead solid black. They never hold their wings up like a mute swan does and just swim around with the wings erect. Many other aspects of their life history are very similar to mute swans, however, but these are huge birds. They're easily 40 pounds. I've worked with waterfowl in the past, and mute swans trumpeter swans are nothing to mess with. If you're messing with a nest of a trumpeter swan, be prepared to confront a very angry, physically challenging species of bird. They're very protective of their nest and their young. Okay, so I promised we'd talk about the 5 golden rings, and this is kind of a sort of controversial thing. So there are some early versions of the song that clearly depict the rings as like jewelry, but there are others that suggest that the rings may be related to either a golden pheasant, which is this guy here. This is a male golden pheasant. You can sort of see golden rings. Or possibly the European goldfinch being the golden ring. So if that were the case, all of the first 7 days would be birds, and all of the remaining 7 days, or all the remaining days would be people. So clearly a sort of strange song, but a fun one for me as somebody who likes to think. And we'll leave you with that. Have a Merry Christmas and look forward to more birds of the month in the new year. Have a good one.